let's have a look at question 1E. So here's our question. It says, explain why we should not use the margin of error rules of thumb to build a confidence interval for the proportion of teens who find managing that privacy difficult or very difficult. Okay, well, let's go and find those pieces of information so we know what we're talking about. So we're talking about proportion of teens who find managing the privacy controls difficult or very difficult. Okay, so in this graph, it's only talking about photos, school name, city, email address, cell phone numbers. There's nothing in here that talks about managing the privacy controls. So let's go back to the actual first part of the article. And it says more than half say it's not difficult, while 1 in 3 say it is not too difficult. And then here, 8% of teen Facebook users say it is somewhat difficult, while less than 1% describe it as very difficult. Okay, so when we're talking about here difficult or very difficult, the difficult, there is 8% of those, and very difficult is less than 1%. Okay, so we're talking about 8% here compared to less than 1%. All right, now we need to explain why we should not use the margin of error when dealing with these numbers here. And what it comes to is there is a couple of key ideas around margin of error. Those rules of thumb we have, okay, for the 3 different scenarios, one sample, and then a comparison within one sample, and a comparison within 2 samples. Those margin of error, if you remember that diagram, those margin of error, there's a little note at the top, and it says the probability P, these work when probability is between 30% and 70%. And so this is one of the key ideas, because when we look at the 2 probabilities that have been identified for us here, 8% and less than 1%, they're not inside that range from 30 to 70%. Okay, 8%, it's way down here somewhere. All right, and 1% down even lower. So these proportions that we're talking about here are outside the range. So that is the first thing that you need to be able to identify. Okay, so we want to say because the proportions of 8% and less than 1% for difficult and or very difficult are outside of the limits of 30% to 70%. Go to the next page. The rules of thumb are not very accurate. So that's the first part of it. And if I just show you here, if you talk about that 30 to 70% range, then that will get you through to the U. What we need to know now is what happens when that proportion is outside. So if I think about all my proportions, 0 to 100, our rules of thumb work between 30 and 70. Okay. However, outside of these range, then the margins of error, if you think about the closer, it's kind of like a normal distribution almost. The closer we get to 0, the smaller that margin of error is actually becoming. All right, and that's the idea behind it here. As the proportion gets closer to 0%, the true margin of error will be smaller than the value from the rules of thumb. Okay, and so being able to explain that part of it, so you being able to do both this explanation here that's outside and this part there, then that gets you through to the merit.